There are many ideas about the link between enlightenment and behavior. Some say there is no link whatsoever, some say there is, but many try to tell whether one is enlightened or not by their behavior. People behave in all kinds of ways whether they're enlightened or not. Everyone has their nature. Some are inclined to live very orderly, for example, some leave more of a mess. A funny way to state the difference between awake and not awake is the underlying knowing for the awake that all is bullshit, or the absence of belief in the conceptual reality. I get where the question is coming from. In the process of waking up, everything increasingly sounds like blah blah. It can be unbearable. One who responds to this constant flow of blah blah may be threatening to those around him, her. Some people will not want to hang around this person because their stories and identities are threatened. This person is basically doing to others what he is doing in his own mind, killing the self. He may do it softly and he may do it in an erratic, more crazy way. However, an enlightened being knows all that is said is blah blah anyway, and there is no one to rid of a self. He or she make no effort of any kind. One is simply oneself, whatever that is. There is no formula for behavior. Because there is no formula, there is no way of knowing how an enlightened one will behave. He or she don't know either. Things are said, and whops, who knew one would say that? To others it can seem completely normal and casual, perhaps sometimes they'll be taken aback by wisdom blurts. Or, it can seem like the dude or dudette are somewhat childlike or just happy. Or, since there isn't a screening against emotions anymore, the person's anger may show a lot more and his natural inclinations towards things that before were suppressed may show more, and people around him might think, what happened to this guy? He used to be so quiet and gentle. Really, he was suppressed and is now free to be himself, according to his nature. I should also say that there certainly are creepy people, and on the spiritual path there are many cuckoos. They may claim to be enlightened too and talk a real good talk. An important thing to remember is an enlightened one has no idea of superiority or inferiority. Those are stories overlaid on top of people, including oneself, in thought. So, enlightenment is actually very ordinary, and a non-event, not an event. During the process, however, it seems like one is going to end up in a place that is so different from how normal people are, that one may behave very differently because one cannot fit into the boxes of society. But that is still a concept, a separation of oneself from everyone and everything else, a thought about oneself. That doesn't exist for the enlightened one. He or she don't think of themselves as enlightened, or any other story. One is simply oneself, whatever that means and however that shows up. At first glance the question seemed a bit absurd to me. But upon further reflection I was able to understand where the op was coming from in asking this question. The choice of the word, creepy, as opposed to asking if enlightened people are corrupt, or fraudulent, or trustworthy, is particularly striking. What makes a person creepy versus simply corrupt? Corrupt people tend to be exploitative, manipulative, dishonest and motivated by self-interest above all else. While we may dislike them, they do not evoke a sense of fear within us per se. On the other hand, a creepy person does evoke a feeling of deep mistrust and even fear within us. While they may display some of the attributes of a corrupt person, they appear to lack, from our perspective, even a most basic moral compass. They seem predatory in nature, often preying on the weakest and most vulnerable in ways that we find truly despicable. Which is why we may find the rotten politician corrupt but we find the abusive Catholic priest creepy. Both are exploitative and manipulative. But we prefer the politician over the priest because the politician and his constituents are equals in our eyes, but the priest and his choir boys are not. We have borne witness to the rise and fall of guru after guru through decades. Each one claimed to be enlightened. Each one's career followed the common pattern of an almost ritualistic exploitation and abuse of their followers. The sordid details of sexual favors curried in return for the promise of enlightenment, emotional and sometimes physical abuse, systematic brainwashing and control of people's relationships to each other and even their loved ones is a narrative that has been done to death. It evokes within us a sort of nausea at a very visceral level. This goes beyond mere corruption, it does feel creepy. How would I define creepy? I'd call it a corruption of the soul. It is compromising our most basic humanity. Sogyal Rinpoche, Osho, Chogyam Trungpa and Edo Shimano Roshi are some names that immediately come to mind in a long list. When you dig enough into the life of pretty much any guru who has ever claimed enlightenment, you will eventually encounter skeletons in their closet. Even a guy like J. Krishnamurti, who comes across as one of the most straight-laced of teachers, is revealed to be not such a stand-up character after all in his adoptive daughter's biography of the man. He is shown to be a petty, self-aggrandizing, hypocritical and opportunistic man with little genuine concern for those who have supported him for decades. With all this overwhelming evidence of the predictable patterns of narcissism and abuse exploitation by these enlightened people of their followers, the OP's question then seems more relevant than any other that can be asked on the topic of enlightenment. There is a common thread to many of the answers on this thread. And that is, a dominant feature of the enlightened person is that they have transcended the game. They no longer are guided by the rules and therefore live outside them. They live spontaneously, unpredictably, and their actions can often be misconstrued as being immoral precisely because they do not conform to society's ideals of individual behavior and decorum. This freedom argument, while partially true, sidesteps the other half of the argument, namely that the dark side of freedom is responsibility. With great freedom comes great responsibility may sound cliched but is an inviolable law of the universe. Those who fail to abide by this principle cause suffering, chaos and confusion. This can be evidenced at pretty much any level of consciousness. Freedom is ironically a kind of burden itself, and those who fail to understand this are not really free but rather exhibit an artificial freedom at the cost of others. In other words, they require others to bear the burden of their own freedom for them. If one has truly transcended the game, it will be hardly noticeable. One's karmic footprint, so to speak, should be barely visible. One's enlightenment should be almost undetectable to anyone who has not. Here is an example to illustrate what I mean. Imagine you are a kindergarten teacher to a class of 5-year-olds. Every child in your class believes in Santa Claus. You, being the kindergarten teacher and an adult, clearly recognize this to be a myth. Therefore, you are the only enlightened being on the matter in this classroom. How do you proceed? Do you ridicule the children? Or perhaps, claim to be the holder of some hidden knowledge? Do you ask for their devotion, worship and obedience so that one day they may even be privy to such realization? Do you use their ignorance as a bargaining chip, to curry favors, to increase your own power and stature in the classroom? Do you inform them, in a matter-of-fact way, that Santa doesn't exist, risking a certain psychological fallout as a result of that revelation? Do you play along and let your children enjoy the myth, fully realizing that one day they will, just as you did, grow out of the need to believe in this myth of Santa? The first option is clearly the most ridiculous. Any kindergarten teacher who behaved in that way would be called psychotic, delusional and downright creepy. The second teacher, while possessing true knowledge, lacks maturity and wisdom because they fail to display basic empathy and an appreciation for the psychology of a child. The third teacher, one might say, is mature and wise not only because they possess knowledge of reality but because they understand how that knowledge blossoms in an individual organically when the time is right. Now, replace the word Santa with the word self. Replace the word kindergarten teacher with enlightened being. Replace the word 5-year-old child with unenlightened being. And reread the scenarios. If enlightened people do exist, we will not easily have heard of them. The majority of the ones we have heard from fall into the first group, with a handful falling into the second.